What's the oldest freight car you've seen on a train? Was it covered in rust and graffiti? Was its original owner still legible? How about the build date? Over the past few years, I've become a lot more interested in these old cars. To me, they're a look into an age of railroading I've only heard stories about. They're a last hurrah of long-gone fallen flags, still bearing names like Missouri Pacific, Norfolk and Western, and Rock Island, the sort of railroads that you would otherwise only see in a museum. And yet, traces of them are still out there on the main line. In some cases, they bear the names of a smaller business I never would have known of, like a far-off short line, or a grain company somewhere in the plains, some perhaps also now passed away. But while it can be more long-term for this rolling stock, just as it is in every industry, the infrastructure of the railroads has a shelf life too. But how long is it? And why is that? In July of 1974, the Association of American Railroads, a group of all major rail companies in the U.S., set the standard for railcar age limits. They ruled that all rolling stock built before July of 74 could operate in interchange service, that is, being interchanged from one railroad to another, for up to 40 years, but can run for 10 more if they got a rebuild, whereas cars built after this date could automatically serve for 50 years. And once these cars got over that age, their next and final destination is a one-way trip to retirement, and most likely scrap. 50 years after these rulings, the AAR and this particular verdict, known as Rule 88, still stand. But this would not be the only regulation put on railcars either. In the 1980s, the AAR banned boxcars with overhead walkways, at one point used for brakemen but now obsolete. And in the late 1990s, cars with plain friction bearings, the original axle bearing that had long since become outdated, were also outlawed from interchange service. But the old yet still allowed railcars from decades past continued to soldier on in the ever-changing railroad landscape. However, with half a century gone by since the founding of Rule 88, the days of these railcars, and in turn the colors of their owners, are starting to be numbered. You may have noticed how railroads like Penn Central, and their cars especially, are not seen much anymore. Rule 88 is the reason for that, and unfortunately, as time goes on, that will likely happen to the rest of the fallen flags. Since cars can last 50 years after their construction, theoretically, the cars of old railroads will last about that much time after their original owner. This means that, for example, all Rock Island cars should be gone by 2030, Norfolk and Western in 2032, the Milwaukee Road in 2036, and so on. But of course, the cars could be gone even earlier than that, as the last ones were likely built well before their company came to an end. This can also mean the last of some of railroading's more interesting footnotes. Take car track, for instance, the railroad's version of a barcode that lasted until the late 70s, therefore making the last cars equipped with car track survivable until the late 2020s. Same goes for the more unique of freight cars, like the massive 6 or 8-axle tank cars, nicknamed rail whales, that have already pretty much entirely disappeared from the mainline scene, as the last of them were made around 1970. And even though there is the argument that excursion trains and private owners still run cars well over 50 on the main line, while I couldn't find much information on what Rule 88 says about this, it can be assumed that those are different since they aren't hauling interchanged revenue freight between customers on a daily basis. However, while this might seem like a message to get out there and catch the last of these veteran pieces of railroading while you still can, there are in fact a few loopholes to this rule that could buy these cars even more time. While there are over 1 million railcars in circulation on American trackage, and more still being built, it's not always enough, and with this policy, that number can continue to decrease. In recent times, there has been concern among builders and owners of freight cars that there is a shortage of rolling stock, primarily boxcars that were built by the thousands in the 1970s and 80s, thus nearing the mandatory end of their lifespan. There has been talk of giving railcars a 65-year service life. Granted, they have adequate rebuilding and maintenance, so they can operate even longer. This was further backed by builders like TTX, whose 89-foot-long flat cars, mostly used for auto racks, are getting up in age. And even more significant than this is another practice. As mentioned, Rule 88 states that rail cars over 50 could not run in interchange service. But what if the cars weren't interchanged? Especially now with the size of current Class 1 railroads, rolling stock can run on one line and still cover a lot of ground. This leads to the next loophole. 3 words: maintenance of way. With railroads being a vast and complex network, it's no wonder they require a lot of upkeep. As a result, railroads usually have a decent roster of equipment for the specific purpose of maintaining all that infrastructure. And most of the time, that maintenance equipment consists of rolling stock dating back to the 1960s, 50s, or even further, having a second life. All they need is some quick MOW writing to specify their occupation, and they're good to go. This has extended beyond average freight cars too, as there have been many occasions of historical equipment like passenger cars, F-units, and even steam locomotive tenders being used for the many jobs that go into keeping a railroad running. So, the freight cars from days gone by can still have a place today hauling the ties, rails, ballast, and wheels wherever the railroad needs them. But even if that doesn't pan out, of course, there is always the chance of preservation. Especially in a business like railroading, progress is a very persistent and very talked about issue. From one generation to the next, there's always something that comes or goes. And even though the day will come when the rail cars of yesteryear see retirement, for many of them, that day has not come yet. And when it does, it's still nice to know that they did their job well of keeping the freight of the nation and the world moving, day in and day out, whether it was for 40, 50, or even more years.